All right, now it's time for cutting. I want to give you some great tips and techniques that I've learned over the years, and some of them have been adapted from industry techniques. First of all, I like to cut my garments out with a rotary cutter. And most people are familiar with the small green cutting mats and wonder, how could I cut a whole garment out on one of those mats? You don't have to use those. Available by mail order, and in some of the bigger fabric stores, you can purchase cutting mats like I have here. I like the one with the grid on the top so I can really see what I'm doing, and I can actually line up the edges of the fabric, and it helps me stay on grain. But you can have these purchased, you can have these cut specifically to your table size. So whatever table size you have, you can just contact the company, purchase the one that's closest to your size, and they'll trim it down for you. It's got wonderful measurements, like I said, a 1-inch grid. It comes in handy for so many other things, and especially if you're a quilter as well as a fashion sewer. So keep that in mind, and it'll be in your resource list where you could possibly pick up one of these. Now, the first thing we do in cutting is we put down a piece of paper. You can use brown craft paper like I have here, or any other type of paper that's sturdy, possibly newsprint, as long as it's well dried and the ink's not going to come off. But we're going to lay this down first before we put our fabric on top. And there's a lot of good reasons for that. It's going to make the whole thing more much easier to control. So we would lay our fabric right on top and get it lined up with the edge of the brown paper. Now I want to talk about the different types of cutting tools you can use when you're cutting. Just a basic pair of nice sharp sewing scissors is excellent. Rotary cutter is my favorite. Now, if you're not familiar with using a rotary cutter, let me highly suggest you get one that's similar to this one. What it has is a locking mechanism. And unless your hand is on the handle, the blade is recessed. This is very important because this is razor sharp, and also because I know many people who have cut themselves with these, and it usually is a lot of bleeding or possibly a trip to the emergency. So if you're not familiar with these, get the locking version. Otherwise, this is my favorite one. It's a little bit larger, but it doesn't make it any better. It just is, it feels good in my hand, and I really like this one. Then for several layers of fabric, you could use a 12-inch scissors, and these are very prominent in the garment industry today. It's very interesting to watch some of the people that have been using these for many years, how skilled they are at cutting with these. They're a tad heavy, but you can cut through many layers of a basic cotton with these. However, if you have any kind of arthritis in your hands, these might not be your favorite tool because they are heavy to use. I like to have with me at the cutting table my little sharp pointed scissors, as well as the little nips that you saw in the kit. These little thread nips are so valuable because you don't have to stop and pick the scissors up, put them in your hand. You can just grab them, they're already ready, slide them in and clip. That's all there is to it. It's got a little spring action on it. So these are great for marking, and I'm going to show you that as we move along here. Now, when you cut with a rotary cutter, we're not going to put pins in the pattern. We're going to use the weights that we showed you in the kit. And fabric weights come in a lot of different sizes and shapes. I highly recommend these. These are really nice. They're full of like a heavy BB kind of thing, and they'll just sit right where you want them, and they'll hold the pattern down. And so you've eliminated having to pin the pattern down, with one exception. Now, if there's an inside sharp 90-degree corner, or sometimes a really pointed outside corner, I still might put a pin in there at a diagonal just to hold that paper flat against the fabric. So now let me go into what you might want to do if you're going into business. And let's say that you have an Etsy shop or you sell at craft fairs, and you're cutting everything out one at a time. Imagine if you could cut out 12 or more at a time, how much time that would save you. You've already cut your cutting time down to 1/12 of what you're doing now. So consider stack cutting. And it's very, very simple. All you need to do is, again, you put the brown paper down, you put your first layer down. Now, keep in mind that each fabric is going to be laid on top of the other. So the bottom fabric should be your widest. And as you may have recognized, at the end of the bolt when you purchase a fabric, it might say 44 to 45 inches. But sometimes you roll it out and find out it's only 42, or maybe it's 46. So measure those before you go to do the stack cutting, because the last thing you want is the shortest piece on the bottom. And the reason for that is because you'll put a piece on there, cut it out, and then find out that you don't have a complete piece. You'll be missing a part of the sleeve or something, and that is no fun. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just lining up the fabric with the paper. And so all the edges are even. This side might not be even. This side might be where one is a little bit shorter than the other. And again, well, I'll just do 3 layers here for you to see. But I could keep going with several more. Even with the rotary cutter, this should easily be able to cut these 6 layers out with the rotary cutter. I should be able to cut out several more with the big scissors. But my favorite is a small rotary electric cutter. This cuts through the fabric like butter. It is absolutely a wonderful tool to have if you're going into production on anything. So if you're going to be cutting multiples, this is fabulous. If you're going to be cutting singles, you don't want this. The reason is that it doesn't like cutting through just 1 or 2 layers of fabric. The fabric will start to flutter and get all caught up in the blade. So you only want this tool if you are doing, like I said, you have a product that you're selling in mass quantities and you want to cut your cutting time down. So let me just demonstrate real quickly how we would use this. So we would measure our straight of the grain, of course. So this isn't the most efficient use of the fabric, so please don't call me out on that. I just want to quickly demonstrate the concept. So I've measured my straight of the grain at this end. I'm going to come down, make sure that my straight of the grain at this end is the same. I'm going to use my weights. I would probably use a few more weights than this, but you'll get the point. Now, here's where I quickly want to talk about marking. Now, on most commercial patterns, you'll see either a V that juts out from the seam allowance, or you'll see a V that goes in from the seam allowance. That's what they call a notch, and that's what we match that notch to another notch to know that we are putting the proper pieces together in the proper direction. In the industry, all we ever use is a slight clip. So wherever you see one of those little notches, you can turn it into a slight clip. And I'm going to show you on this pattern. This happens to be one of my patterns, and so all my notches are clips. So if you've purchased one of my patterns, you'll see just a small little line. That's a notch. And notches generally should be made at half the distance of the seam allowance. So if you have a 5/8 inch seam allowance, you can take a 1/4 inch snip. But if you have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, you better keep that much shorter than a 1/4 of an inch. But what's really special about using these notches is it matches up perfectly. When you line that fabric up, as I'll show you later, those notches match up perfectly. There's no more guesswork. And you can cut with a rotary cutter because you don't have to stop and cut around those notches. So what I'd like to do now is show you how this power cutter works, just real quickly. I just need a little room here. And as you can see, there's a blade here. It's a round blade. I'm going to turn this on and I'm going to cut through this fabric. Now notice that I'm going to cut right through the paper as well as the fabric. There's a guard on the front, and you want that down close to the fabric but not directly in contact with the fabric. It'll just protect your fingers if you get your hand in front of the blade. But you can see this slices right through here really quickly. Whoops. So I'll just peel this out of the way. And I'll come down this side. Under that paper. Sometimes you'll have to hang on to the fabric a little bit on the edge. But here's what's so beautiful about using the paper, is that you know how when you're cutting out of a garment like this and you've got this neckline and it's away from you, so now you have to twist your arm around. What's really nice about the paper, without disturbing anything, I can just turn this around and get it at whatever angle I like, and it all stays perfectly still. I'm not going to continue to cut this because I think you get the idea, but that's a power cutter for those of you who want to cut out mass quantities at one time. Now again, on the snips, we're going to snip the center front and center back of anything. Most patterns will not have a notch at the center. This is how you keep your collars and your neckline straight and make sure everything stays true. If I'm sewing from one end to the center and I get to the center and they don't match, I know I've gone wrong somewhere and I can stop before I've completed the whole seam and made a mistake. So center, make your own notches on any pattern you have and it will serve you fabulously. So all we need to do is either take the snips or the little pointed scissors and just make our little clip. And it's just that simple. And you can see I went through all 6 layers and those clips are going to match up perfectly now. If for some reason the fabric won't take the clip, it's too much of a ravelly fabric and you're worried about clipping it, you have the choice of a tailor chalk. Tailor chalk is usually one of the better things to use, and it usually disappears with the heat of the iron. Same with the friction gel pens. These are Pilot brand friction erasable gel pens. You need all of that in the title for it to work. And again, you want to test any marking on your fabric prior to actually marking the fabric. It's perfectly fine to use just about anything that's a marking tool for sewing if it's inside the seam allowance. But if it's going to end up on the surface of the garment where maybe you're marking a stitching line or maybe you're marking where the pocket goes, you definitely want to test then, because that can be a huge disappointment when the marking doesn't go away. Now my favorite marking tool is generally the chalkener. The chalkener makes a very nice, very fine line. So when you need to be very exact with your marking, the chalkener and the gel pen are the 2 favorite things to really make sure that you're getting spot on. There are some marking tools that are available that are like felt tip markers, and they disappear with either water or air. But the problem with those is, one, they dry out really quickly, but moreover, they get really sloppy and fuzzy, and then they make a really wide mark, and now you aren't as precise. And if you're a person who wants to be very precise with your sewing, the finer lines are much better. Now, one other thing I want to talk about as far as the cutting, and let's say you go to trace out your patterns. Patterns today come in multiple sizes. Most people want to preserve that pattern. I do, so I take tracing paper and I trace out the size that I want. And that way, I have all the sizes still intact, should I want to make it for someone else, Or should I change sizes, which I do pretty regularly? Or should I lose one of the pieces, I can still go back to the master pattern and find that little piece that kind of floated away, like a little trim piece or something. Those seem to disappear very quickly. I like to use what's called doctor's examination table paper, which is exactly what it is. I buy it at the medical supply place, or you can easily find them online. But it's very sturdy, but you can also see through it. So it's great for tracing out patterns. Another alternative would be Swedish tracing paper, and it's also available at a lot of sources. So one last thing about those of you who might want to go into production of a product or an item and you want to make a lot of them. The best thing to do is you're cutting, so let's say we're cutting out 12 at a time. Now we have 12 and we have all the pieces for 12 different projects, but they're all the same type of project, but we have 12. So what we do is we take all of the pieces that go into one product and we do what's called bundling. So what we do is we take all the pieces. Here I have a shirt bundled, all ready to make. So inside the bundle I would put the thread, the buttons, any kind of notions I need, all the pattern pieces, and I would interface all my pattern pieces the day that I cut. So now I have this bundle, and I can hand this to somebody who's working for me and helping me sew, or I can just, in the morning, I come into my studio, I have the bundle, I take one bundle out, I open it up, everything I need is here. I don't have to say, oh my gosh, I forgot I don't have any more white thread. Oh my gosh, I forgot I don't have the buttons for this. I know I'm ready to make this project. And so bundling it up, just taking a scrap or some salvage and tying around it, and then you can just stack those up and you're just ready to go. All right, one more trick I want to talk to you about, and that is using the doctor's examination table paper for a couple of other little cutting tips. One would be, let's say that you're cutting out something out of a tricot, or one of my favorites to use this for would be knit interfacing. After you cut it out, and by the time you get it to the sewing machine, you notice how it's like bigger and longer, maybe it's stretched out a little bit. If you use the doctor's examination table paper, put it down, put your fabric on top of it, then pin your pattern to it, right through to the bottom layer of the paper. Cut it out. When you take it to the sewing machine, you leave the paper attached to it, and you actually sew it with the paper attached to it. Now the tricot is the same size everywhere, and it doesn't have the opportunity when you pick it up to stretch it because it's still attached to the paper. And then the second tip is, if you've ever worked with fabrics that have a nap, I do a lot of silk velvet and also knits. And when you lay them out, all of a sudden they grab a hold of each other and you'll see a diagonal ripple in the fabric. And so then you walk around the table and you try to stretch it the other way, and all that does is cause another ripple. And you move around and around. It's very frustrating. So all you have to do, this is so slick, pull the fabric back from being folded on top of itself, roll a piece of this paper right down that, and then put the top layer back on top of it. Now the nap of the fabric can't touch each other. So they can't do anything but lay out nice and smooth, and now you pin your pattern to it and you cut it out. It's just that slick. So you might want to try that the next time you're having difficulty getting fabric to lay flat on the table and behave like it should. Well, that's about it for cutting and marking right now. I'll have some more tips as we move along. Be sure to post your questions or any comments on the discussion board. We'd love to hear from you.